Hi there. Hi there. We're going to start. Welcome, students, faculty, friends, alumni, administrators. Welcome to this special evening lecture for our distinguished international visiting scholar. I'm going to be very brief. I will start by saying, if you've received the program, I'm not John Kirby. I am Will Green, the chairman of Landscape Architecture, and I am so pleased to be able to welcome you here. This is a special event. We've brought Graham Young from South Africa, and I'll just give you 1 minute of telling you how this began. I was fortunate to spend time in Pretoria, at the University of Pretoria, in 2009, where I was on a sabbatical, and I spent my time in the landscape architecture department, or with the landscape architecture group. Graham Young was a mother hen to me, my wife, and my family. He led us around. He gave us itineraries for parks to visit and places to go. And I also attended a number of his classes as a senior instructor in landscape architecture. And I got to see him with his students. I got to see him thinking about landscape architecture. And then I was very fortunate to be dragged along with him, or by him, to a special landscape in Pretoria, which he spoke about the other day. So for the last 2 years, I've been thinking about how to get Graham Young to the United States to be able to share his academic background, his experience, and the contributions that he's really made in South Africa to a group of people who don't know very much about South Africa and its politics and the changing environment in which he grew up and the changed environment in which he works. So with that, I would normally be very long-winded and give you an introduction, but I'm not going to. I would like to introduce the provost of the university, Donald DeHaze, who will be able to introduce our speaker, and without whom this program would not have occurred. Don DeHaze.
Now, if I touch all this computers here, I will have made at least one enemy, so I'll try not to do that. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here, particularly on this sort of nasty evening out there, as you all were courageous to venture out in the rain to come and hear the presentation by Graham Young. I want to say just a couple of words before I introduce him. As Will just mentioned, this program is part of what we're now calling, we started a year or two ago here at URI, our Visiting International Scholars Program. And this whole concept is to take leading scholars and scholar practitioners from around the world and bring them to our campus for an extended visit, 4, 5, 6, 7 days, whatever they can spare. And really, the opportunity is for us to learn from some of the world's leading scholars about the work that they do in other parts of the world. And while here, a chance for our students and our faculty and our staff to have the marvelous experience of talking with, listening to, maybe even having a meal with scholars from other parts of the world that we normally don't have an opportunity to interact with. And Graham Young is one of those leading international scholars in his field of landscape architecture. I had lunch with Graham yesterday, and I sort of quoted to him a statement made from a colleague of mine, Bill McDonough, who's a landscape architect and designer. He said, and this always sort of stuck with me, that design is a signal of intention. And I love the concept because it really allows us to think, as many of you already know, that design isn't only about beauty. Design isn't only about function. Design isn't only about physical structures. Design is a mechanism by which we can integrate all of those concepts and more, whether we're talking about a landscape, a building, a curriculum, or a university. So I'm really taken with the concept of design and designers. And it's really a privilege and an honor for the University of Rhode Island to have one of the world's leading architects, landscape architects, here on our campus. Graham Young has spent 30 years consulting and teaching landscape architecture, mostly in South Africa and in Canada. He's a senior member of the design firm Newtown Landscape Architects in Pretoria, and he is also on the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Pretoria, where he teaches many, many students and has won numerous awards. Now, he has designed numerous parks, but there's one that I would be remiss if I didn't mention it because it's famous throughout the world. He is best known for his work on Freedom Park, a memorial that narrates the story of South Africa's pre- and post-apartheid history and heritage, spanning a period of millions, billions perhaps, years of humanity, which acknowledges those that contributed to the freedom of his country. So once again, we're seeing a way that design not only contributes to ideas and beauty, but to culture and to history and to an expression of modern-day version of freedom. He's a former president of the Institute of Landscape Architects of South Africa and has published widely on landscape architectural issues in design journals and books. He has also been a visiting studio critic at the University of Witwatersrand and the University of Cape Town. It is my pleasure and our pleasure at the University of Rhode Island to welcome Graham Young to speak about transforming urban open space, the development of parks in Soweto. Graham, the floor is yours.
Well, just to thank you to the university, the president, the provost, the deans that I met, and of course to Will Green for making it possible for me to be here and share with you some of the projects and the kinds of things that we get involved with in South Africa. Whilst I've been talking quite a bit about Freedom Park, and it was mentioned here just now, a project which might be at sort of the high end of dealing with some of the very real issues of where we've come from in South Africa to where we're going in terms of memorial and reconciliation of the various peoples of South Africa. This, what I'm going to talk to you about today, is a little bit more humble in the sense that it's really dealing with the disadvantaged people in the township of Soweto, but is equally as important in terms of trying to provide for those who have not had the privileges in the past. So again, thank you to the university for bringing me here. I've really enjoyed my stay. It's been great weather up until today. But a little rain never hurt anyone. I mean, in South Africa, we cherish every bit of rain we get, so I'm enjoying it. Right, so I think we can start then with the talk. Are we going to lower the lights a little bit? I don't know if it's needed, or I'm looking up there. There we go. Thank you. All right. While the lights are trying to come down a little bit, just for those of you who might not know what we're dealing with and where we are, we're in Africa. South Africa, Southern Africa, and that little dot there that you see on the at the base of the bottom of Africa is the city of Johannesburg, located within within South Africa itself. Now, I'm going to be talking to you about Soweto, and maybe we need to know a little bit about Soweto. Johannesburg, the city of Johannesburg, it was developed as a mining town at the turn of the century. A mining town, and eventually evolved into a city for white business and white people. The black and the populations that wanted to move into the city environment were not able to do so, and were confined to townships and the outskirts of the city. People could come into the city and they could buy things, they could do business, but they would have to go back out of the city of Johannesburg and to the townships like Soweto and Katlehong and places around the city. They couldn't even own businesses in their own environments in places like Soweto because that was banned. You had to, if you were going to purchase something, it had to be from a white business in the center of the city. So townships like Soweto, which evolved then on the periphery of the city, where people were moved to and placed to essentially be a workforce for the white businesses and the mines and the businesses in Johannesburg itself, began to start or designed and developed on the periphery of the cities. Maybe that's fine. That's okay. I think that'll be fine, yeah. So Soweto, even in its naming, stands for Southwestern Townships. That's how it came out, the Southwestern Townships. There wasn't anything magical about it. It's just we will put the people there and that's where they belong. Now, I'm not going to give you a complete history of South Africa, but we've had a violent history. And the brunt of the violence were the black and the poorer communities, people living in Soweto. And this all came to a head in 1976 when the students of Soweto rioted against the police. They were fed up with being taught in Afrikaans, the language that was that all South Africans were taught in all the schools. And they said, this is nonsense. And they went to the streets and they protested. And the result of that was that people were shot indiscriminately. This is a photograph by Ralph Kumalo of Hector Peterson, the first student who was shot in the Soweto riots in 1976. And today there is a memorial in Soweto to this occasion, and specifically to Hector Peterson. The situation then was that anything after 76, it was really the beginning of the end for the apartheid regime. And anything that had to do with the apartheid regime would be attacked, vandalized. Political statements would be made through that means. And included in this were the systems or park systems that the government had tried to build in places like Soweto. So over the years, these places became abandoned places that weren't of any value really, other than that they were open. And parks then did not enjoy a high profile in South African cities, but specifically in the township areas. Politicians considered these low on the priority of lists of things to do as we're moving into perhaps a new South Africa. And the people themselves saw these places as a place to squat or graze their livestock, or they should actually be developed for housing. Here you can see what would have been a little open space system or tributary to a river which has been filled in with housing. And this is the kind of stuff, or people bringing their livestock in from the rural areas and using it to graze, or people just simply setting up shanty towns in the areas which otherwise would be natural environments or places for perhaps parks. So parks and open space systems really didn't exist in any way in South Africa. Certainly in the black townships of South Africa. And if there were any, they were maintained, or they were poorly maintained or vandalized. But what was interesting, a movement started in the 1980s in Mamelodi Township, and they called it People's Parks. And it's ironic that they chose parks as a form of political protest. None of these parks exist anymore, and there's very few photographs of them. But the idea behind them was that because the government was coming down so heavily on anyone who protested, the youth got together and literally overnight would develop a park with a few benches and plant some trees or put in a sculptural element. But there was always an overt political overtone to what they were doing. And of course, at first, the police didn't know what was going on, and they thought, oh, how cute, how romantic, the guys are building parks. When they had a closer look, they realized that they were being aimed at them as a form of political protest. And so literally days in and days out, these parks would get built overnight and then pulled down by the police the next day. So in the park systems themselves, something that was used as a form to protest against anything that the white government had put in, the blacks were using these parks in a way to make political statements. So the problem then with what we're dealing with, if we're trying to take South Africa into a new situation after '94, and I'll get to that in a minute, was that whatever park system we had, whatever parks existed in these places, there was no ownership of them. There was a lack of ownership. There was no meaningful experience that people could have in these places. And parks just became sterile landscapes. Although they had been developed, they were vandalized and became sterile landscapes. No identity, no sense of place, really just a place over there that was falling apart, becoming decrepit, and not adding anything to the community. And whatever parks were developed were located in areas perhaps where they were not valued. For instance, in the white suburban areas, where we have the white suburban situation with suburban sprawl. They didn't really need parks because they had huge, big properties within which each of the needs of, let's say, a park system or a park place would happen within the confines of their own house or their own residential area. So parks were still being built in areas where they were perhaps not needed. And of course, the danger of all this is that if people have no reason to associate with a park or value it in any way, they're never going to embrace it as something that's important in their community. And here again, you see, this is the township of Alexander. There's Johannesburg in the background, and this used to be a park system that came through the center. Well, it was an open space system, and it's now been filled up with shacks. People finding thousands of people coming back into the cities now, and now that after the apartheid movement, it was you didn't have to have a pass to come into the city, which you used to have in the past. They were now coming, and there was no housing. There was no housing stock to take up this, so people would simply set up a shack in this kind of environment. So the issues then, from coming out of all of this, is that in the townships where parks were most needed, they were hopelessly underprovided for. The method for designing parks did not foster any kind of sense of community, because in the past, the government would simply rock up, put up a few swings and maybe a few benches, create a few amenities in the park, but never engage with the community. And so whatever parks there were, usually, as I said, got vandalized. Parks were bereft of any human healthy community activity. I think for obvious reasons. And then parks were not designed along any ecological principles. They were still using the old horticultural principle of a park system, which would require huge amounts of maintenance. And so when they were not maintained, quickly they would decline in value and an aesthetic appearance and appeal, and become a liability rather than an asset. But then a magic thing happened in South Africa. In 1991, 10th of February, I'm sure many of you might remember that day. I certainly did. I sat in front of the television. I was in Canada at the time, waiting for the release of President, or at the time, Nelson Mandela. And that changed the history of South Africa forever. And then eventually, in 1994, South Africans for the first time, all South Africans for the first time got to vote. And this is the lineup that I was in at one stage, waiting to vote. And it was an amazing situation because we had kilometers and kilometers of people waiting to vote patiently. There was no disruption. There was unbelievable peace and harmony, where literally 2 or 3 weeks before this happened, there was actually a threat of civil war. And so this magical moment happened when the so-called Rainbow Nation was born. And at that point, things began to start changing and moving in a different direction. At this point, it was actually quite a wonderful, there's not too many countries in the world where you get a situation where everything that you've done in the past is up for evaluation and debate and discussion, and you could change things. And so that was happening. So how do we address the inadequacies? How do we address the disparities? How do we plan cities? How do we, create work, and so on and so forth? Everything was up for debate, which was fantastic. And then, of course, the political agenda then began to start focusing on developing resources in a sustainable manner and providing facilities like recreation facilities in previously disadvantaged areas. So within this and moving through into this new South Africa, another thing that happened in 1992 was Agenda 21, in the Rio Conference and Agenda 21, which was essentially an action plan for sustainable development. And what this action plan was saying was that in addition to environmental issues, the key thing coming out of this was that participation and cooperation of local authorities through a participatory process was required in any planning process. And this came from the Rio Conference, but the South African government embraced this and brought it into their new legislation. And so in 1995, and from that point onwards, when the new legislation started coming in, the idea of integrated development planning took place, and the principles that were embodied in the Agenda 21 were then begun to start being embedded in the legislation which was beginning to come out in the new South Africa. And during this process, the Soweto Integrated Development Plan was developed. Essentially, it was a plan to try and normalize Soweto, because up until this point in time, Soweto, the township, was essentially a bedroom community. You couldn't own a business there. You could live there. You could go into the white city and buy things and come back at night again, but it was pretty dysfunctional. So now the Soweto Integrated Development Plan was trying to look at a way of creating a viable framework that would set up the infrastructure and circumstances for people to begin to start living in an environment that had the amenities that was due to them. Out of this process came the so-called LDO, or the Local Development Objectives. And during the process of developing these integrated development plans, a process of communication and engagement with the communities across South Africa, every single municipality went through this process of developing a framework for their town or areas of town. And a part of that process meant you needed to engage with the communities. And so supporting this documentation and studies was an ecological or environmental study for the open space system in Soweto. However, because of the past perhaps, and because of the situation and the deterioration of these open space systems into areas that no one wanted to use, people felt totally unsafe in them. There was nothing really that people liked about the ideas that were coming out or being proposed by the planners and the landscape architects and the like, that these open space systems, these riverine systems, should become the focus of park systems in Soweto. We did a study, and in that study, going out to the community, we got this kind of response. 62% of the respondents stated outright that there was nothing that they liked about this particular open space system. 50% of them had security concerns and said they feared being raped or robbed in these environments. And another 64% identified these places as a place actually where you dump your rubbish, and that is it. So you can see that there was only a small percentage of people who saw any value in them. And a huge public relations effort was then perhaps needed to change these perceptions. But the commonly held negative perspective of these parks and these open space systems and urban river systems had already begun to change, and people realized, as we can see in these images here, that perhaps they have value. In this case, growing some vegetables or maybe even fishing. Well, I wouldn't want to eat the fish in that river, but anyway. And also people from the rural communities who are now streaming back into the cities, brought with them animals that they would graze in these riverine systems. So they saw them as a place, a functional place perhaps, a place to grow food and a place to graze your cattle, but not necessarily as a place for recreation or amenity. We're going to now look at that park system that we're involved with, developing initially a framework for, and then the park that I'll talk about as a case study. Soweto has there's a ridge system that runs through the center of Johannesburg, with all the rivers that flow to the south of it, flow into the Klip River system and into the Indian Ocean, and to the north they flow out and into the Atlantic Ocean. And what we were then looking at were the tributaries of this particular system in the Soweto township. That was the study area. In the study area, we developed in the early stages a framework, which was really it was a framework to try and understand and how one would manage these systems. It looked at managed open space as one of the components of it. Managed reed beds, and that was an important thing because the reed beds in these riverine systems provided a huge environmental asset in that they filtered out a lot of the pollution that was coming. You can see here, these are the mining dumps that were such a landmark in Johannesburg, which would then drain off with toxic runoff and into these riverine systems. Yet these reeds were providing an important environmental cleansing function in the river. But the locals saw that as a threat to them because it was a place that was dangerous and a place where people could get raped or robbed or killed. There is an existing park system which we understood and mapped. There was existing formal and informal sports facilities. The conservation areas were mapped. The eco links, which were the areas associated with the power lines, were mapped as a potential ecological link to some of these conservation areas, and then areas of urban agriculture. So these were the main components of this river framework system for the river. And as part of this process came out the idea of a pilot project. This was originally sponsored by Danset, which is a Danish aid organization, who said, well, let's try and go into Soweto because there's such a dearth of parks in Soweto. Let's go into the township and try and get a pilot project going which might get the ball rolling, as it were, for the development of other parks in the township. So, using the principles, common principles for the design and development of parks, these were the ones that came to the fore when we started looking at developing these park systems. First of all, we need to incorporate the social values of the people in the area. We need to design and develop them and making sure that we encourage public participation in this process. We also need to make sure, because the parks have been such an unsafe place, to try and create and design a situation where we have environments which are now safe. Because if they're not safe, they'll have no value for the people in those communities. And then capitalize on the nature of place. How do you take the nature of the environment and design according to ecological principles? And then the last point, which was, if possible, try and ensure financial feasibility and productivity. And that would mean that private sector become involved in some way with the government organizations to create a situation where funding could come through maybe private leasing of some of this public land. So the most important part, and what this is mostly about tonight, is the fact that we had to engage with the community and try and change these perceptions so that people would understand the value of this park system that would be developed in the township areas. And it's important to engage with the community because they have an unbelievably valuable insights into what is in the area and what functions and what works and doesn't work. And so you need to tap into this process, through this process, and begin to get a sense of the community and try to encourage ownership of this development of these parks. The other thing that was important in this process was then to develop with the community a vision for the parks that we were designing. And finally was to try and find some ways to get work opportunities out of this project, because most people in South Africa and Soweto we'd be dealing with an unemployment rate of 30 or 40%. So job opportunity was extremely important. And then, of course, the role of the designer is to try and create a vision for these parks that would instill a sense of pride and anticipation in the people living in these areas. So when you're engaging intimately with the community, as you see in this photograph here, you're beginning to make that connection and beginning to understand that perhaps the visioning plan will eventually hold promise and begin to be implemented in the area. So what is our role as designers in this whole process? First of all, we need to listen. I think designers need to listen very carefully. We need to understand who we're dealing with and what it is that their needs are, and try and identify the key issues that the community will want us to deal with in the designing process. We need to certainly help the community envisage their park and illustrate the various options that they might have for the development and the implementation of this vision. And then we need to paint a picture of somehow this is the artistic rendering of what this place can become for the community, so that this can become their park. And what it really boiled down to, in their paraphrasing some of their words, was that they just said it would be a good park, a place that provides a range of things to do with a multitude of activities for different age groups and types of people. It would be easy to get to and be connected to the surrounding community. It would be a safe place, a clean place, and attractive, and provide places for people to sit and socialize. The park would be neighborly. It would be like it was ours. And so that essentially was the briefing document that came out of a lot of these processes that we were going through. Let's now look at one of the case studies, the Morocco Dam precinct. So as landscape architects, the first thing we want to get our head around is what exists and what is there. And this, the major asset, or the major plus that we have in Soweto, or had in Soweto back then, was that there was quite a bit of open space in which to work. But a lot of it was, as I said, had degenerated and fallen into a complete disarray. And this situation, which was the area that was chosen as a priority park in the framework integrated plan for Soweto, we have a situation here where ash from the nearby power stations had been dumped into this area here. It had polluted. This used to be a dam. It's now completely silted up. And the community remembered fondly their dam into our meetings with them. And that was one of the things that they were very adamant about, that they wanted their dam to be returned to its state of open water. And then this particular section of the park was sort of maintained. But you can see by the river system here, this little brown line here, that the quality of the water coming down and through these, this system was highly silted up. There were high levels of contamination, probably produced by sewers and grey water, and the wetlands upstream of the dam were badly polluted. So we're dealing with a pretty bad situation to start with. But we did have an open space and a place in the community where we could maybe begin to start focusing our activities. This is a photograph of the councillor for the area, beginning to explain in the early days of the community participation the process that we would be going through as we try to elicit ideas and go back to the community with ideas. This person on the right here is from the Johannesburg Parks Department, who is then translating for us into one of the local languages. And the engineer explaining the aspect of the engineering and the hydrology, which was very important, which I'll get to in a minute. And we would just take simple diagrams to the community and illustrate what the problems were, or what the opportunities and constraints might be for the development of this park. And so we will build up the idea and the vision for what this could become. This is a photograph of when we had now come up with the final design after many to's and fro's with the local community. The guy that we were supposed to meet in the community hall, but the chap who had the keys didn't show up. So this is us on the back of the wall of the community hall, setting up, explaining the situation to the community, and explaining what we anticipated to do with taking their vision and make it become a reality. And so in this process, the mandate for the development of this park became very clear from the community. They wanted to be involved in the process in all phases of the project. And they had already been involved in the early planning phases, as I've already discussed. They wanted us to make sure that the dam, which was now an unsafe place, a place for dumping, a place where crime was occurring on a regular basis, to be opened up back to open water and rehabilitated. And they wanted to make sure that the park was safe and had a lot of recreation facilities in it. And then lastly, and not the least, they wanted to make sure during this process that they were given jobs or somehow that they could become part of the process of working and earning a bit of an income while this park was implemented. And these are some of the requests that came out of that, out of these things. They were not overly sophisticated, or it was just basic things that people want, like shaded seating areas. They wanted the parks to be lit up at night because that was important, as they were used as a place for people to move through. Quite a few of them wanted a waterfall. That we couldn't accommodate. Boating, well, they can boat. Multi-surface place where they can play basketball and have meetings or dance festivals. A braai facility, that's a barbecue facility. Play areas, picnic areas, a botanical garden and a fence. They wanted the thing to be fenced in. Through a long process, we convinced them that fencing it in was actually going to perhaps decrease the security issue rather than increase it. Because once you got into the park, if there was a problem, you had only one exit. And so we convinced them that a fence was not needed because it would, first of all, be a huge cost item, that money could also be spent elsewhere in the park, and secondly, that from a security point of view, it really wasn't making it any secure. Those of you who have been to South Africa know that we're obsessed with fences, I'm afraid to say. Every house and every community is gated with fences and walls and barbed wire. I think you'll be quite shocked for those people who come from an environment like this, where you drive around and there's wonderful forests and farms and houses with no fencing around it. It really is wonderful to be able to experience that. But then going back to the design, so this was the site of the original seed money that was coming from the Danish organization. You can see that it's a pretty messed up kind of a place. This was the dam. There's just a little pool of water left over. We basically said this was a diagram we showed them, very simple. We're going to do something about the dam. We're going to give you a play or design a play area here at activity node, and this was the access route that they used to cross the property, and that would become lit up and made into a clear access way with open views on either side, picnic areas and open play area. And they were happy with that, and that's so. A very basic plan was drawn up, and we started the process. But just as we were starting the process, the mayor of Johannesburg heard that this was on the go, and that Danset had made some monies available. And he remembers, as a child growing up in this area, he remembers the dam being open and a place where he used to go and play as a child. And we were heading, this was now just around 2002, and the World Environmental Summit was coming to Johannesburg, and they were looking for what they called showcase projects. So he said to us, the design team and the planners in-house at the municipality, please come down and talk to my Mayoralty committee. We need to know what's going on. We need to have a showcase project for the World Summit, and we're thinking that this might be one of those places. So we went down. Fortunately, we'd done all the work. We designed it. We engaged with the community. We were ready to go when we were making this presentation. So we went in, made the presentation to the mayor and his committee, and they thought it was wonderful. And they said, well, how much is it going to cost to build it? And we told them the figure, which I think at that stage was about 10 million rand. And he said, oh, okay, we've got 20 million rand. Go ahead. We need not only that park, but we want you to expand the park system. So they began to start at this point now, because one of the main issues we had was, how do we create this dam over here by desilting it, but put in process a system that would prevent it from silting up in the future, because there's huge silt loads that come from the surrounding community areas here. And so we said, well, in order for this to work, we need to do something upstream of it, and I'll talk to that in a little while. And at the same time, there was designs for the Regina Mundi Church, which we had prepared in the framework study, and they looked at those and they said, well, why don't we do that as well? Regina Mundi Church, by the way, has an interesting American connection, because I think it was Ted Kennedy. It was Ted Kennedy, when he came to South Africa, I think it was in the 80s, he visited this church, which was a place of refuge during the apartheid era where people were being chased by the police or harassed, they would often go to this church. And today you can still go to the church and see the bullet holes in the sides of the church where the police, for the most part, left people alone once they got into the church, but on a few occasions they would chase them into the church. And so the park associated with the Regina Mundi Church became a bit of a park of remembrance and was designed as such. So all of a sudden what was a smallish project was beginning to grow into a rather big project for this part of Soweto. And the idea then of the Thokoza, or the Morocco Dam Park, was now increasing to include the Regina Mundi Park, the Morocco Park, and then what we needed to do with the wetlands upstream of it, which I'm going to talk about it to you in a minute. So the primary focus of this park for the community was the water. They remembered the dam. It was important to them. It was a place where they would recreate, swim, and do all sorts of things, picnic around it, etc. And so it was important that we reclaimed the dam, which we were quite easily able to do by just desilting it. But then we had to look at a system of preventing the silt from, again, inundating the dam, and literally 10 or 15 years down the road we'll be back to where it was when we got hold of it. So we designed upstream of it a silt trap, which would be well, exactly what it says it is. Water would come in through here. It would come through a confined area. It would open up, drop its silt load, and go into here, into the main dam with less silt in the stream. However, that wouldn't be enough. We needed to then, upstream of it, rehabilitate the floodplain in the area and begin to start looking at rehabilitating the streams that enter into the dam eventually. And also we needed to then develop flood attenuation ponds, that when the storm waters would surge, they would move into these ponds, slowly release the water back into the ground or back into the stream system. And then as the water came into these systems in a stormwater situation, it would go and move into the attenuation ponds and then come out a little bit cleaner and then down the river and eventually back into the Klip River system. So from a sort of an engineering point of view, this was the approach that we took to dealing with the problem of silt in an engineering but also an ecological manner. And here you can see in the early stages where they're taking the ash heap away from the area where these wetland streams would be rehabilitated and these detention ponds would be built, and then the desilting of the dam was begun, and the silt trap was beginning to be built in that location there. And then this is in the early days, soon after the silt traps and the work had been done in those areas. And the water management objectives that we were really trying to deal with here was, as I said, to a method of trapping or training the silt so it didn't get into the dam, trying to improve the quality of the water that moved from these township surrounding areas into the rivers and then into the pond, and then also to attenuate the flood surge. So, and then here's another interesting benefit from all of this, was that these detention ponds were sodded over, and one of the reasons that the silt load was so high was that a lot of the roads in this area and also the properties were open bare ground. And anyone that's been to South Africa knows when it rains there, it usually comes down very heavily for short periods of time, and just you had huge flows of water picking up silt and taking it down and into the river systems. So by what we were looking to do, what was happening at the same time, the roads were being upgraded, but we were also providing a service here where we said to the community, once the sod is established, you can go in and harvest it for free and take it and begin to start using it in your gardens wherever you needed to do it. So there was a sort of mechanism of harvesting when the sod which was given to the community for free. So the water would come into these systems, into the detention ponds, and then flow into the riverine system. Of course, we needed to upgrade the river or the stream that came through here, and through a system in creating meandering and developing rock barriers in the system to sort of simulate a natural riverine system. We were able to build that and develop that into the river. and create wetland patches that would form part of the habitat mosaic that would be required to reinstate the ecology of these rivers. And so, of course, these methods were all going to try and increase the quality of the water and deal with attenuation and the flood peak during the summer months. And here you can see now the dam has been developed. The silt trap in the foreground here has been developed as well, and the park around it is beginning to be developed. And then after once the dam was established and the park was established, these are some aerials that give you a feel for the place from the air. The park and the dam quite clearly developed up in this area here, and the beginnings of the development of the park in this area here, which really related mostly to sort of barbecuing areas and some parking areas and play areas in the other parts here. And here you can begin to see the effectiveness of the silt. The water is coming in a little bit brown. It's been the silt trap is doing what it's supposed to do. It's been colonized by reeds, and the water then that disperses into the pond, the dam further down is cleaner than what it came in. So it was beginning to do its job. The idea would be that after a number of years, this would be desilted, and the same process would start up again. And here you have it on ground level, an idea of what was happening there. The other important and exciting aspect of this project was that in the tender documentation, and coming again out of the public participation process, we took the lead and we said, well, we would like to incorporate art into the park in some way. And we felt that if the art that was going to be incorporated into the park was coming from the community, it would be more meaningful to the community, and they would also begin to start taking ownership perhaps of the park. And so what we did as part of the tender documentation, we provided a sum of money that would be allocated for employing, I suppose we're employing, but really teaching women to deal with the art of mosaic. But before I get on to that, just the statistics with regards to the amount of labor that we were also able to get out of this project, where in the tender documentation we said that 20% of the total contract value had to stay within the community. And what we meant by that was literally within about 1 kilometer of the community, and the community liaison officer who was appointed by the councillor, his task was to determine who got these jobs, and you can imagine there was huge competition for this. And unfortunately, there wasn't too much disruption, and at the end of the day, the project was able to employ for a period of about 12 months 45 female laborers and 66 male laborers. And these were unskilled people who, during the process of this, the installation, would have gained some skills during the process. And back to the mosaic. So what we did was we made money available through the contract for the training of people, and these would be women from the community, to learn the art of mosaic and to eventually take their skill and develop mosaic pieces that would be placed into the park system. The first phase, while we were training the ladies, and a wonderful woman called Erika Luttig, who trains these women, starts training them basically in some of the basics, the very fundamentals of not beginning with artworks, but beginning with how do you deal with money? How do you account for money? How do you use a bank? Because a lot of these women had not ever had that opportunity. None of them knew how to draw. They were very timid in the early stages. They didn't want to draw. And so slowly she would coax out of the woman some very basic fundamental life skills, but also the skills of drawing and eventually the mosaics. But as the project got started, it became part of this World Summit project, as I was saying. There was an imperative to put it into the ground now all of a sudden fairly quickly. So the first phase, we used some local artists who already had some skill in mosaics, and our design team just created a pattern which they wanted at the entrance to the park, which essentially was sort of a stylized image of what was in the park. And here you can see Erika here working on the thing, a couple of my colleagues working on the mosaic, and then the locals installing it in this location in the park. And here you see an image of it, which is basically the river running through it, and the pathway systems, and the trees, and the children playing. It was just, these were the ideas that they gave us that we then put into this mosaic, but they couldn't draw them out. In the second phase of the project, the women had now been trained for quite a few months, and were beginning to get confidence. And of a larger group, eventually 14 women and one gentleman who had offered and volunteered for this process, we began to start the training in the second phase of the project. And then they would participate in workshops. And as I say, during these workshops, Erica would emphasize writing skills, design skills, and how to manage your finances, stuff like that. And eventually, she would also then ask them, well, if we're going to do mosaics in the park, artwork in the park, what are the kinds of, what would you like to see there? And initially, they began to start dealing with issues like no fire, or pick up the litter, or play nicely together, or save fuel. These were the ideas that they would give to her, and they mostly dealt with rights in the park, and to create an awareness for people using the park to look after the park. And so the first set of mosaics then went in this location where you see the arrow there. And here you can see the process of the women who have now begun to start drawing out at 1-to-1 scale the images that you'll see in a moment. And they would work here as well as at the local church, but they liked to work in the park because they were there working in front of their family and friends that would come and visit, and then often the children would also participate in this process. And here you can see them installing the artworks on the edge of a paved area, and then the children again. It became quite an event as this happened, as part of the of course as this began to start happening, so the ownership and the idea of the park being in their place began to start taking hold. Here you can see them putting the finishing touches onto the mosaics. And there you see the context of them on the edge of this paved area. And then if you look in detail, here you see some of these rather beautiful little mosaics. I love Soweto, save fuel. Do not make fires. There's a fire engine. And throw away your litter. One of them said condomize. I couldn't find that one. Care for the trees. So these were issues and rights that people were that they were important to the women. Then in the third phase, and perhaps this one was perhaps one of the most powerful mosaics that was placed in the park, and it's derived from the abuse of women, general abuse of women, but specifically during the apartheid era. And in 1956, the women of South Africa rose up and marched on Parliament in Pretoria, and their slogan was "Abitinta umfazi, abitinta umbokodo." You strike the woman, you strike the rock. That was the theme of this march. And the ladies said, we really want to do a mosaic that would express that theme and place it in the park. And so, using the slogan, they began to start creating now their own designs, a mosaic which eventually was placed in the park. And here you can see them placing it with the barbed wire to protect it while they were installing it. They placed it, they wanted a rock in the middle of it, and they wanted it placed right in the middle of a pathway that if you're walking through the park, you are confronted by, if you strike the rock, you strike the woman, or you strike the woman, you strike the rock. And it was very clear that they wanted the location that they wanted it, and the positioning, and the fact that they wanted the rock. And here you can see them installing it in this little triangular piece of land, and there's one of the men who's afraid to go near the rock. But that's the location of it. And then this very beautiful, rather naive, but really beautiful mosaic which came from this process. The last, or the next to last mosaic was created at a place near the all-purpose courts on the top where that arrow is there, in this area here. And the woman had this just shows you where the women are working in the church, where it's becoming quite a sophisticated operation. They're now well on the way to drawing and making their own designs and doing the mosaic themselves. But they had came to Erica one day and they said, there's a little orphanage nearby here, and we would, and the children always come down and play on the swings in the park. We would like the children to make portraits of themselves. And then we would like to take those portraits and make them into a mosaic and then build that into the park. And so that's the process of what you're seeing here. They were beginning to start building these drawings, which the children drew at about an A4 size scale, and they were scaled up to about an A3 size, which would be the size of the panel which went into this location. And here you can see the beginnings of how they're doing the mosaics. They would draw onto the base first and then start cutting and placing the mosaic. And some wonderful designs came out of this, as you'll see in a minute. And that's the context of the location. This is the all-purpose basketball court, the seating sort of amphitheater situation, and then this was like a little stage area around which we placed all of these mosaics that were created by the children initially and then developed by the women. And over here on the left-hand side, over here, you can see the arrow where that previous mosaic was that I talked about. And so this was the end result. These are some of the imagery of the mosaics that came out, and rather sad in many ways, but colorful and quite beautiful at the same time. Protect me, this little girl says. Anyone who knows anything about art therapy will know and see that a lot of the children's imagery is of them with very short arms or no hands, which is indicative of some form of abuse or hardship in their life, and often that is an indication of that. And so we here have a little girl who's done her portrait and saying, "Protect me," and another one asking to please care for me, another one saying, "Please educate me." And Victoria, who got it around backwards, but it's a beautiful image of her. And this one, I don't know where this came from, but a beautiful hairdo. And then thank you, children of the park. Thank you to the children of the park. This was what the ladies built into the mosaic of the imagery of the portrait of the child that they'd been drawn. They added the words into that. And another one of a girl, they said, "Thank you to the children of the park." And we're not sure who this is, but we think it might be Erica because it's not a black person. And another one of her interpretation of Erica. They really fell in love with her, and she did some wonderful work with her. And then finally, just as the other component of the last component of this park was then to take to join the two parks together, going up to the Regina Mundi Church, as you can see in these lawns which lead up to it. The sort of beginnings of this park of remembrance and the church itself as the focal element in the park. And just some imagery of that. And then I just want to get to this mosaic here, because this is the last of the mosaics. And this is actually quite a wonderful one. When you sit in this bench, you have that beautiful perspective view down to the church. And again, this was a narrative by the ladies, and essentially what it is it's taking you from that image I showed you of Hector Peterson from the school riots all the way through on the right-hand side here to the elections that we had in 1994. So this pictorial mosaic that they've built into the back of the bench, starting with the June 16th Orlando Stadium riots that took place, going through the slogans that they had during the anti-apartheid movement, through to being put into jail, being taken away in the police car, the police coming and arresting people. And the township sort of scene in the background, a beautiful mosaic leading up to the Pollsmoor prison where President Mandela was held, his day of release with Nelson and Winnie Mandela walking to triumph there, and then finally, there you see them again, finally then the voting day that we saw, those lineups of the people voting, and then the the image of the Union buildings was where President Nelson Mandela was inaugurated in 1994. So just some images of the park, and then that'll be it. So this is what it looks like today. It's from those early images that you saw of a derelict place of dumping refuse, crime, not a safe place to be, a place that people didn't value at all, to perhaps an amenity that they now value and understand that they have been part of this whole process and are proud of the process. These are the barbecue or braai areas. The entrance to the park, even the mosaics ended up being, this is for men entrance. The little play areas designed into various parts of the park. The dam and the central crossing, which was very important, which was that main access route across the park, which people used to be very afraid to use, which was now well lit up at night, and also a place that everyday people are walking across. And so, to sort of end off then with these words, when we can effectively interweave human activities and natural processes into one integrated system, we can reverse the trend of urban rivers and open spaces becoming fragmented, threatened, and perhaps ignored, and begin a healing process of the land and of the people. When this occurs, then the role of open space in our urban, well, it has occurred in our urban landscape, is redefined to have new significance and relevance for the citizens of South African cities, and especially for those in disadvantaged communities. Thank you.
Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Does the park have a soccer field?
Yes. Yeah, it didn't have a formal one. It had an informal soccer field, but eventually we had to put posts up. And the detention ponds became grazing areas, soccer fields, you name it. There was a lot of open space for that to happen. Yes, soccer, yes, it's the World Cup. It's even more crazy with soccer in South Africa. And if you ever go to Orlando Pirates Kaiser Chiefs game, which is just the two local teams from Soweto, there will be 80,000 people at those games in the stadium that maybe some of you have seen in the Soccer World Cup, the so-called Soccer City. I just saw Coldplay there. They were really cool.
Yes, sir.
I was noticing the homes on the perimeter edges of the parks are pretty good quality in detail. After the park system that was established, did it have a positive economic influence on the value of those perimeter homes being establishing more value than the homes further away from the park system?
Property in Soweto is not necessarily... most of the people had 99-year leases on those properties, and we're still going through the process of trying to legal transfer and title ownership to a lot of those properties, because they were built as part of the apartheid era building, and a black person could never own a piece of land. And so a lot of those properties are still officially governed, but not really. And so we're now going through a process of trying to normalize that in terms of ownership. So I wouldn't be able to answer that question, but I would imagine that people would want to be... The other good thing about the park was that you notice that there are roads all the way around it, which was done specifically by the government in the planning of the park, so that they could get vehicles up and down quickly and see what was going on. It actually is a wonderful asset for the park, in that now you have houses across the road from the park. It sort of extends the park, and the idea of eyes on the park, security, comes into play. So that was a benefit that we got from the old regime, unintentionally by the old regime. Yeah. Yes.
What type of mine was it that you mentioned earlier, and were mine spoils part of the sediment or silt that you were discussing?
Those are the gold mines. Johannesburg is undermined by gold mines. That's the city of gold, Josie, Igoli. And those mining dumps that you see there were up up until about 2 or 3 years ago, they were extended in a band across the southern part of the city. They've all now been remined because with new technology, gold and the price and value of gold, they've been able to remine them effectively. And so all of those mine dumps, which were a landmark, a horrible landmark in some ways, have now gone and turned into slimes dams somewhere else. So the residual is still there, but it's not in the same form as those mines. But you would get drainage off the mines and it would end up into the river system. And so those reed beds that we have in the system now form, because the locals, one of the things they wanted to do was take all the reeds out of all of the rivers. Because what happens with the Tsotsis or the criminals would rob a house and then run into the reeds and get away. And that kind of stuff was happening. Or if you crossed over the river through the reeds, if you were taking your life in hand. So they saw it as a real major safety issue. And we had to fight to explain the environmental potential for that. Because if you took up those reeds, you were going to open up a can of worms, literally. Yes. Yeah.
You had said that in the past, squatting had been an issue in parks. I was wondering if it was still an issue in this park, and if so, how do you control it?
No, squatting did not happen in the park, in this park, and hasn't happened. It hasn't been a threat here. And I think the whole perception of parks, because immediately after 1994, when the ANC government was promising all sorts of things, the one thing they were promising is housing. And to a large degree, I mean, there's been hundreds of thousands of houses built in South Africa right now. There still are huge squatting communities like you see there. If you go down to the Cape, you fly into Cape Town, you fly over Khayelitsha, huge, like just masses of squatting or shanty towns. But in Soweto, in that area, that didn't happen. And what happened was that because the park has become very successful, a lot of councillors in other parts of Soweto are now were pressurized then by and going and saying, well, how come this councillor, well, how come they get parks? We want parks now like that. And so it became a bit of a data. And once the realization of the value that these were bringing to the community set in, there was, well, Johannesburg City Parks has put in probably about 100 parks since we did this one. This was the first one. So there's been a huge mind change towards that, towards the parks are, you know.
Those new parks, are they with local money, or is it like the Dutch company that funded this park?
No, it was a Danish company, Danset. The money that Danset made available was about, all it could cover really was cleaning up the park. We had no idea how we were going to implement it. So it was a godsend that you know, things happened serendipitously. All the planning had been done. The community liaison had done. We had a design. Everything was in place. But we had no money other than to clean it up. But we were going to do that. We were going to go in and make a first step. And then the World Summit, which came to Johannesburg, the World Summit of Sustainability in 2002, and then all of a sudden, the story I told you, we need a showcase project. And the mayor happened to live in that area when he was a child. And within matters we had, well, the park ended up costing about 60 million rand. And we had nothing. So, and it had to be built in 8 months, the first park. So there was huge pressure to get this thing in for the World Summit. But all of those things had lined up. Had they not lined up, maybe it would have gone a different course. Probably still would have got it built eventually, but not as and when it was.
So there's money available for the additional parks that they're building now?
Yes, the government has prioritized park development. In fact, there's just been another huge incentive. When I say the government, now I'm talking about the state government, has put a lot of money into the development of parks, and Johannesburg City Parks, you know, the agent that have to install them. And it's not only there's some wonderful stories I could tell you about Khayelitsha and Cape Town and how parks have worked there, but I won't tell you tonight. And it is money that's coming from the state government, which is wonderful because it's seen as infrastructural. It's like roads and houses and parks. They're now part of that same. They speak that in the same breath. Whereas before, as I said, the attitude by politicians was this is the last thing we want to get involved in. not going to win us any brownie points, and it's not going to deliver on what we're being asked to deliver.
Okay, two more. One right here and then up here. Three more, maybe.
Do you know if the communities like how the impacts would affect the town and the parking community in terms of like lower crime rates or anything like that?
Yeah, we haven't, it's empirical evidence, we don't have any researched evidence, but definitely we know that the crime rate has dropped dramatically in the area. And the parks are used extensively. Weddings happen there. You know, I'm told, I haven't been there on some of the busy weekends, but you can get up to 20,000, 30,000 people in the parks on some weekends when they, because you've got the church there where they're having funerals and weddings going on all the time. And then you've got people wanting to get married in the park. So we designed a few terrace areas around the park where they come and set up tents. And that happens, and then there's just the general thing that's going on. So there's people there now, and that's one of the biggest things. If you get people into the place, that begins to start policing itself. And there was an incident of mugging when we were designing the park, and that happened to be my employee who got his cell phone stolen at night to hitch. But in South Africa, that's not a big deal.
Yes, up here.
What particular things did you use in that silt trap?
Well, it was reeds and a hole. Very basic. The idea was as the water came down in the river, it opened up, slowed down the water. The silt would start dropping out. But the reeds have been incredibly effective. I've done this before in another project in the 80s, and it works. It's been very effective. The idea, though, would be to manage the so-called silt trap, because after a while it will get silted up to the point that the water is just going to flow through and over. So we anticipate after about 8 years, about now, we need to maybe go in and start digging it out, which would happen in the we have a very distinct dry and wet season, so it's quite handy when it comes to that kind of thing. So it was very basic, just a hole and the dimension and the reeds growing back into it.
Final question of the evening.
Yes, I wonder if you have any plans to put in wooden benches? Because I happened to be in New York City yesterday, and I wandered around Central Park. All these benches which conform to the body, and you can lean back against them comfortably. I noticed you had some concrete benches, but they didn't look comfortable for really sitting and reading. And also in New York City, there's a trend now for individual movable chairs, so that people can orient them to the sun, or they can be with friends and groupings. And this is in Bryant Park, which is right behind the New York Public Library, and also in Madison Square Park. But I didn't see a lot of comfortable seating, and I imagine it gets very, very hot there. Is there a shaded area? Are there shaded areas where people can sit on the ground? I saw them sitting on the ground.
Yeah, well, that's how they prefer to sit a lot of the time.
Can you afford some nice benches?
Well, anything loose or partially loose has a problem of staying put.
They cement them down in New York City.
Yeah, no, I know. We in other parks we have installed them, but we've used that sort of what we call a seating wall system, and which seems to work very fine, quite well. And then the forested area that you saw there provides a lot of shade. But people like to just go to the park and put something down and lay and sit on the grass. They've never complained that there aren't benches, for instance, in the park. We do have a problem with loose fitting type, although you can cement them down in. Things get cut off and taken away, especially if it's steel, because steel gets recycled. And I mean, the Freedom Park project I was talking to you about, some of the poles leading up in the main street leading up to Freedom Park have been cut down and taken away to people that are dealing with scrap metal. So it's a little different context, but I hear what you're saying, yeah. But it's never a complaint that's come through to us as the designers.
Great. Graham, on behalf of the University of Rhode Island, we thank you, not only for this evening's stimulating and thoughtful lecture, but for a whole week's worth of work. And Will has been running this poor guy ragged here for the last week. And we're very, very grateful for the opportunity to share your designs and really share the heart and soul of the communities that you work with. Thank you very much.